Hey, today I've got a special guest on our show, Chris Hughes. He's a CEO of Aquila. He's a chief security advisor. He's an author. He's a veteran. He's done amazing stuff, and I think you would love to hear what he's got on his mind. So stick around. Hello, and welcome to another episode of CISO Tradecraft, the podcast that provides you with the information, knowledge, and wisdom to be a more effective cybersecurity leader. My name is G. Mark Hardy. I'm your host for today, and I've got a special guest on the show, Chris Hughes. Chris, welcome to the show.
I'm excited to be here. I've listened to many episodes over the last several years, so I'm excited to be on.
Awesome. So hopefully this is your opportunity to, well, of course, obviously you're going to be on an episode, but more importantly, to contribute to the body of knowledge that we've been trying to build here at CISO Tradecraft for people in the cybersecurity career. So first of all, let's I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself. Tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got to where you are right now.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm the CEO of a company named Aquia. It's a government-focused, cybersecurity consulting company or digital services more broadly. But by way of background, I've been in the federal, and commercial IT cyberspace for about 20 years. I was active duty Air Force and then a government employee at a couple of different agencies, doing cloud, DevSecOps, cybersecurity kind of stuff. And then started my own company. And then outside that, a lot of industry engagement. I have a Substack called Resilient Cyber where I do a lot of writing and just sharing a newsletter on industry news and things like that, and as well as like kind of, separate pieces and deep dives in different topics. Um, I have authored a couple books, one called Software Transparency that focuses on software supply chain security, everything from, IoT, open source, critical infrastructure, that kind of stuff. And then another book after that one called Effective Vulnerability Management, where I went really deep in the topic of vulnerability management and, kind of I don't want to say all the things that are wrong with the ecosystem, but a lot of problems we have and some innovations and opportunities as well. So I'm excited to be on and, like I said, a big fan of the show and excited to be part of the community.
Well, great. Well, first of all, thank you for your service. Appreciate that. For those of us who've had the privilege to wear the cloth of our nation, time goes so fast, doesn't it? So,
It does.
you're on the other side. And I remember when I finished, I had 30 years of misspent youth in the Navy. And then when it came time to retire, of course, you don't want to go. You kind of miss the camaraderie and everything else like that. And one of my buddies, probably one of the better pieces of advice, said, hey, you work really hard to create and defend the system of government and the way of life we have. So why don't you go enjoy that way of life that you helped to go ahead and provide? So again, thanks on behalf of everybody who is willing to extend that thanks to you. But I also understand you doing other stuff. I mean, a cyber innovation fellow at CISA. Is that something
Yeah.
that's still going on, or is that
No,
something that?
I wrapped up that last year. That was kind of an interesting non-governmental kind of appointment, as they call it, non-governmental employee. So kind of they bring in folks from industry with various areas of expertise. Mine was supply chain security and vulnerability management and cloud and things like that. You get to collaborate with some of the folks within CISA that are working on different things, industry working groups, publications for the community, stuff like that. And it was a great opportunity to me, for me to be able to, again, kind of the service aspect, like get involved in government while still, not leaving the company I've started and some of the work that I'm doing in the commercial space. So I had a lot of great times there, met some great folks, and they're doing a lot of awesome work for the community over there.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think this is supply chain. I had Cassie Crossley on my show.
Hmm.
I'm guessing about a year ago. I was about number 171, and we're now at 226. So do the math on it. And what we're finding then is that from a perspective of supply chain, and I want to go into that a little bit, and then we want to talk about some of your other books, is we're seeing more and more the nature of how products and even software are put together, that it's very difficult to identify a provenance for what's going into our system. If I go ahead and I'm trying to remember who it was, but somebody had said they decided to do a little project, try to go ahead and say, without using anything else other than your own resources, make one of these. This is a pencil, nothing fancy. He said after years, realized that it can't be done all by itself. Yes, you can grow a tree. I guess you can go ahead and cut the tree down, but then you need to get an axe. So you got to create some tool to cut down the tree. And then you have to get the lead in there, or you can get the graphite, then you have to refine it, and then the little metal thing and the rubber on the end, and then the ink and the paint. And it turned out that there's so many different inputs in something as simple as a pencil. We'll multiply that by orders of magnitude when we look at other things that are going on. And I think the error might be that we think software is not that, but it's just monolithic. Oh, I just coded it up and I'm done. But what do you see, and what should CISOs and other security experts be aware of of the potential dangers with respect to supply chain, and it comes to our not only our software systems, but even the hardware that runs it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting and broad question. And first off, Cassie is awesome. Her book on supply chain security, definitely recommend folks check that out. And there's a lot of challenges around software supply chain security, like you talked about. Kind of sourcing materials in our world that often is open source software. It can it's part of, like, I think it's 90% plus of every single code base that's they're looking at. 70% or more of the modern code bases entirely are made of open source software components. In terms of provenance, we don't really know who these things came from, what their intentions are, what they may or may have not done to it. And many folks don't even know what's in the product that they're using, right? In terms of vendors selling them software or applications and services and so on. You don't really understand the components, the dependencies, the things that are in those products. And it's kind of crazy that we're in this world of zero trust, where it's like no implicit trust. But when it comes to software, we implicitly trust random people on the internet all the time to put these components into things that we use, and we really don't know where they came from, what they've done to them, and that kind of thing. And I think attackers have gotten really keen to that, over the last several years in particular. That's why we've seen things like the Cybersecurity Executive Order and things like that gain traction as attackers start targeting the supply chain more, both in the commercial front and the open source front. Um, and there's also some challenges. Like I've written a piece recently talking about this. We try to draw parallels for software supply chain to other supply chains, like, say, medical or automobile manufacturers and stuff. The challenge there, like, looking at automobiles, there's really stringent regulations and requirements. There's only, several thousands of automobile suppliers around the world. But in software, there's literally millions. Like, you could have thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people around the world contributing to this and putting things out on the internet that people are using, and then they get used and used. It's like, these nested dependencies, as they call it, of direct and transitive dependencies that are in your software, these different components and libraries, and they're taking advantage of it in a lot of different ways, whether it's maliciously inserting malicious code in there, going after the developers who are using things, doing typo squatting, like just really unique social engineering type attacks. We recently saw a supply chain attack against something called TJ Actions, I think it was, like a GitHub action that was targeted last week that made the news. So there's a lot of, we have a porous and problematic ecosystem when it comes to software, and the attackers are taking advantage of it in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I'm looking through the table of contents right now in your software transparency book. Of course, you start out with the software supply chain threats, but then you talk about things such as vendor risk management and our vulnerability databases. Now, I think a lot of times we tend to think of vulnerabilities as being stuff that we get with has a CBSS score assigned to it. It's something that somebody else discovers. It's posted. We then have to go ahead and do a risk assessment. A, do we have it implemented? B, is this on a mission critical system? And C, can we patch it without taking down that business operation? If the answer is yes, yes, and yes, and it's just high enough score and we got the time for it, yeah, we do it. But how does that tie into supply chain risk with respect to looking at vulnerability databases? Does it at all? And if so, what should we also be thinking about in addition to just waiting for the latest list to come out or the latest Super Patch Tuesday, which says, oh, we're fixing all of these things?
Yeah, as you point out, historically we use CVEs, or common vulnerabilities and enumerations, from the NIST National Vulnerability Database. We love our acronyms in cyber, by the way, the NVD, which has some challenges that we can get into there around the vulnerability database ecosystem itself. But as you said, like, proprietary commercial products often will have CVEs associated with a vulnerability, and people can run scans of different vulnerability scanning tools that we use and identify these CVEs and see, is there a patch available? Is it on a critical system? Am I able to patch this without causing operational disruption? But when it comes to open source, the landscape is much more vast, and many of these things don't have unique CVE identifiers for them. Or if they do, you have to kind of track it down, not just on NVD, but the OSV or GitHub Security Advisory Database, and on and on and on. Like, there's many different sources of truth, and trying to reconcile that as an organization or an enterprise can be challenging. And that's just things that have an identifier. There's things like misconfigurations and things like that that need to be considered too. And then there's there are resources out there. Like, for example, OWASP has the Open Source Software Top 10 list. It looks at not just known vulnerabilities, but how often is something maintained? When was it last updated? Who's contributing to it? Minimizing the bloat of the software that you have. Do I need all these dependencies and libraries, for example, or can I minimize this to just what's needed to run the software? Um, there's a lot of different factors that you should be looking at. Open source of not just known vulnerabilities, but who's maintaining it, how often it's maintained, when it's last been updated, if you're using the latest version, and on and on. Like there's a lot of different. CVEs are kind of lagging indicators of risk, right? At that point, we know there's a problem. It has an identity assigned to it, but there's leading indicators of risk that we can get ahead of and start to look at something and say, hey, there's not a problem here yet, but there very well could be here soon. And how will we respond to it?
Well, I think a good leading indicator is, has a vendor put out a new version of anything? Because
Yep.
almost always we'll find out that although they might have been fixing old vulnerabilities or old weaknesses, they're probably adding some functionality, because you always want to keep moving forward. I worked as a software developer, and we always had a queue of things to put in and get this going. And we had them prioritized and stuff like that. And of course, if there's a weakness or vulnerability, you want to go ahead and move that to the top of the stuff you're going to work on. And depending on the size of the organization, you talked about supply chain. This is a little small company, and we remember we had this the sales guy came back and said, "Hey, we can get a sale this week if you put this feature in the software." And we're like, "Well, yeah, it's number 27 on the list." They said, "We'll make payroll on Friday if you can put this feature in this week." You're like, "Okay, it's number 1 on the list." And so what happens is you adapt to the market and things like that. Now, I used to get, and I still get them from CISA, uh, alerts of things that, hey, this vulnerability is discovered, or this has been found, and things like that. So we look at the CVEs and identification. And oh, by the way, quick little aside here for people: CVEs are not assigned in, if you will, chronological or numerical order, are they?
No.
Is
No, and then there's also the problem that, just to your point there a second ago, I wanna touch on that is, we have these competing incentives. We often in security, like, we like to think we're the kind of the center of the universe, right? Like, the world revolves around us, the business revolves around us, but the business, believe it or not, is in the business of making money and generating revenue and having a return for shareholders and things like that. So, as much as we love cybersecurity, things like speed to market and feature development, customer attraction, retention, like those often will come ahead of security, and that's just the nature of how it is, unless we have a systematic kind of paradigm change.
Yeah. And that's really one of the challenge for security leaders, is to drive home the point that we're in the business of revenue protection. We're not a cost center. Rather, we enable all these other profit centers to actually generate a profit. And for anybody who's taken a look at some of the major breaches that have taken place, and either the cost to repair or the regulatory fines or anything else, they realize that, yeah, those are a lot of times unforced errors on behalf of the business. That with a proper investment upfront in cybersecurity, they're able to go ahead and potentially avoid, either, maybe not entirely, but you could certainly avoid the impact of some of these things, simply because you've got controls in place that will identify, hey, something is going sideways. Let's go ahead and drop all the barriers, if we will, while I start to isolate systems and stop the lateral movement of a potential adversary. But back to the CVEs and things like that. So one of the things I had noted is that you look at a CV and like, wait a minute, what do you mean 2023? It just came out yesterday. Or all of a sudden it's CVE 2025 9999. It's like, how in the world did we get that high? Any insight in terms of how those numbers are generated?
Yeah, so I think there is a date component in terms of, chronological order in terms of when it's discovered and documented. There's like a whole ecosystem of what they call CNAs, CVE numbering authorities who could, kind of, it's a whole ecosystem. They submit
Right.
these CVEs to be, add to the catalog, and they get an ID and things like that. And then they, add numerical numbers after that. But there's an aspect of when it's reported, when it's identified, when it's analyzed, when it's added to the MVD, that kind of thing. In terms of how we're getting up to those numbers so high, it's really amazing when you look at the figures that, for folks interested, there's a vulnerability researcher named Gary Gamblin who puts out some really great insights on LinkedIn. Um, and he showed, like, last year we exceeded 40,000 CVEs just last year. The number now is 200,000 plus in the NVD. That's just the NVD. Again, not OSV, not OSS index, not GitHub security advisories, in the other n number of sources of vulnerability data and advisories out there. So 200,000 plus, 40,000 just last year. He showed that we're on a pace. I think it's like 35% or something year over year growth so far, just in 2025 over 2024, which already had double digit growth as well. So organizations are simply drowning. The vulnerability backlogs are, hundreds of thousands, even millions in large enterprise environments. So these things keep piling up. And organizations, like as you said, if you're an SMB, right, you live below the kind of quote unquote, peripheral, like the the cybersecurity poverty line, as it's been called by Wendy and others,
Mhm.
you are in a really challenging situation. And even if you're in a large enterprise environment, again, to your previous point, you may be coming and pointing these things out, but you're competing with other things like speed to market, feature velocity, new customer requests. So you have your work cut out for you, and the problem
Mhm.
is getting worse. It's not getting any easier, and we can dive into like perhaps like how AI and things like that, play a role and may make it worse or better. But safe to say we have a lot of work to do, and not enough people to do it.
Yeah, I kinda wish my 401k were able to give the return that we're getting in terms of those vulnerabilities. We'd all be set for life at this point. So, obviously, the more complex we get, I think it was Bruce Schneier that said complexity is the enemy of security, and if he didn't, I'm sure he probably did at some point, and I like to give attribution where possible. But we look at the CVSS, and it's evolved. We started out at 1, and, I got into it when it's CVS version 2, then we had 3, 3.1, and now version 4. And so we're finding then is that it's more than just a baseline score, and one of the things is you cannot just take a raw number and say, "Oh, this is a 9.8, so I'm gonna make it the most important thing." In fact, it just has to do with your vulnerability to understanding and also what's actually been exploited in the real world. A 9.8 that came out a few years ago, I think was Poodle. And yet I don't know of any real world in the wild exploit of that outside of been demonstrated in a laboratory. So from that perspective, as CISOs, as security leaders, when we're faced with the potential challenge of an overwhelming number of vulnerabilities being reported, being charted, being presented to us, and then being told, okay, you've got to solve this with the resources you have, and we don't have enough resources. What's your advice to how do you deal with this problem that's sort of like clearing out the Augean stables? It's beyond the scope of one person.
Yeah, this is a topic that can and has been the focal of like many conversations. It could be an entire episode, and this is what kind of led me down the path. Is I've been in roles as doing vulnerability management and doing Nessus scans, and like it's like a treadmill, like a gerbil on a treadmill, just running around over and over, week after week, and never getting anywhere. And it's because of the problem that we've been discussing, and that's why we've been seeing. So what happens is historically we've used these CVSS scores, right? And they have a base score of a 9.2 or whatever, right? A
Mhm.
numerical score, but it has no real relevance to your particular organization, for example, um, in terms of your environment, the applications that you're running, those kind of things. And it also has no, kind of context around known exploitation, exploitability, likelihood of exploitation. So we've seen these additional kind of systems or kind of scoring mechanisms pop up. One that's taken a lot of interest in the last several years is called EPSS, the Exploit Prediction Scoring System.
Mhm.
And that one looks at like it looks ahead 30 days and kind of gives you a predictive number, a probability score between 0 and 1 that the CVE will be exploited in the next 30 days, right? You can kind of adjust that based on your, risk tolerance as an organization, and it's pretty, you know, accurate in terms of they broke down how it does over the course of a year and how it performs. Um, so people are starting to use that. There's of course sources like CISA's CAV or Known Exploited Vulnerability Catalog, where you can go and say, hey, not only is this thing likely to be exploited, it's already been exploited. We have evidence of known exploitation in the wild against organizations, and you can lean into that. And I'll add that the CAV, like anything else, any of these databases we talked about, is not infallible. It's not perfect. There's other people who have built on that and found additional exploitation that the CAV didn't find and things like that. But the CAV is a great place to start. It's a free resource to the community, again, to CISA's credit. And then so you have EPSS, you have CAV, and then there's additional tools that are coming out, more modern like software composition analysis or runtime, security tools. They're now looking at, things like, is it reachable, right?
Mhm.
It may be known to be exploited. It may be likely to be exploited. It may be a critical, quote unquote, a critical, but can I even reach it in a production environment or reach it in the code base? Does this function get called or, is this system even reachable based on my architecture? Those kind of things. And you do it window down, pretty significantly. They show, I think it's like 95, 98%. You can get a reduction in kind of the noise and the toil and the burden that you would have if you just use a CVSS base score. And that has a cultural element to it too. Going back to your point about being a business enabler, for many years in security, we've kind of just ran scans and threw it over the wall to developers and engineers and said, "Hey, you got to figure this out before you can go to production, before you can have this next product release, whatever the case is." And that has fostered a lot of resentment, a lack of trust, and frustration on both the development part and the business's part with security. So I think it's in our best interest, to kind of optimize prioritization using some of the things we talked about to build back that trust, make it an actual manageable problem that's not intractable, and help them move faster as a business while still, kind of protecting the revenue as you talked about.
And for those who are interested in the CVSS or the EPSS, I know EPSS, their version 4 came out a week ago. And so that's updated. You'll find them on first.org. And so it's a reference for that. So a very good point about the reachability issue, because if you have systems that are isolated, well, air gapped, and of course I use little air quotes on the air gap because an awful lot of times we find out systems somehow get cross connected. We didn't expect to, but somehow they do. And then also people have demonstrated more laboratory than anything else. Oh wow, I could cause this hard drive to spin this way and then get audio and then pick it up over here and then make it do this and transmit information in Morse code. And well, it's really not necessarily considered to be a real exfil. It's going to be pretty slow to get stuff out that way. But more to the point is that you're indicated the relationship you have not only with the business, but with the IT and the dev team. And they're both important because as IT security, one thing, if you're not doing it right, management views you as a cost center. You're just a tax on the organization. You slow things down. You're the department of no. And while we have compliance, which is the only reason you probably even have a budget in the first place, is because we have to be compliant. But we all know as security professionals that compliance does not equal excellence in the security. It's a minimum passing grade. Then we have the relationship with the development team who just sees security as a pain in the, well, you know what? To say they keep coming up and manufacturing all these requirements that we've been running perfectly fine without this in there. We haven't needed to go ahead and change our crypto algorithms or put this particular thing in our code base. And there's never been a problem with it. But why are they banging on this drum when we've got all these other things lined up on our list of things to do? So if we look at the political reality of these relationships, it transcends the functional requirement. It's not just can you get your job done and then go home? It's can you create positive working relationships with two primary groups that have the potential to, well, make your life difficult. And there may be more. But what are your thoughts about that from the political perspective and your experience you've had over the 20 plus years you've been doing this?
Man, you just laid out so many great points that we could dig into on each of those. And, first off, like you talked about, the kind of the political realm and the relationships and building, rapport. Often in security, I feel like historically it's been like you were looked down upon if you weren't quote unquote technical. But we're realizing the soft skills, the communication, the empathy, the building trust, the building relationships, that's actually the quality stuff that makes the biggest difference. You build those relationships, you have an opportunity now to drive the ball forward for security much better than if you just come in as the office of no and tell people they can't do things and slam your hand on the desk, as you said, and you kind of be a blocker. And what happens in that case is we often foster what we call shadow. You hear shadow IT, shadow SaaS, shadow whatever. It's because they don't want to work with us. They don't want to engage with us because of the way we behave and the way we've done things. So they work around us, and then we perpetuate the age old, bolted on rather than built in, security paradigm that we all know and love so well. So that's part of it. And then, so building those relationships, building that, the trust with your peers, things like that, bringing context rich, information to, making decisions around vulnerabilities is so critical. And then, being a business enabler, as you said, of, helping the business, in my opinion, not say no, but you can say, here's the risk of doing said activity. You're in a position as the business to make a risk informed decision on whether you want to move forward with something or not. You're empowering them, with that information rather than just saying yes or no. You could say, here's how we could do it the most secure way possible. Here's some options. Here's some recommendations, and let them kind of drive with that. So I think that's, the key points that you made. It really jumped out to me is doing those things are far more important than, any technical depth in terms of a particular technology or a scan or whatever, right? Technology will change, but those human relationships, those kind of things are critical.
And what I advise people is you want to not be the department of no, you want to be the department of how. When someone says we want to do something, well, here's how to do it in a way that keeps our risk within an acceptable level. Now, ultimately, the risk appetite of the organization is going to drive your decision making. And it's really important to understand what that risk appetite is from senior management and leadership. And then also try to align your own actions. Because if you're, if you will, a cowboy and you're working in a very conservative organization, there's going to be some issues there. Conversely, the other way is around where you're working for someone who says, what the heck, we'll just do it live. And you're the person who wants to do everything measured and carefully. You're going to be very uncomfortable in that position because you're going to be way out of your comfort zone. So a lot of what we find then is that for success career-wise transcends your technical skills, even your communications, management, leadership skills, and political awareness. It's is there a good fit? And this is tough area to look into because we spend so much time looking at the technical stuff, and we can write books upon things such as software and supply chain and security and things such as that, and look at vulnerability management. But do you have any thoughts or insights in terms of how to read the organization? I've got some friends right now who are looking for other jobs, either because their old positions kind of terminated abruptly, or the organizations are changing, or sometimes they just said, I don't like it here. Any thoughts you have in terms of how would you figure out where you're going to land and land safely so that you don't find yourself in 3 to 6 months going, why am I here?
Yeah, this is a good question. I feel like to be honest, at least in my experience, it gets easier to navigate the longer you've been in doing this because you kind of got those war wounds. You know what to look out for. You know what kind of questions to ask of the leadership and the team and how they handle certain things, things like that. But just having those open conversations during perhaps the hiring process to ask, how do they define organizational risk tolerance? What happens if they have a situation that exceeds that risk tolerance? Is someone willing to put their name on a dotted line and sign off on things? Is security there, to really be a trusted, collaborative partner to the business, or merely to check some boxes due to compliance, for example, as you talked about earlier? And just real quick, while I said that, you said something earlier. You said you kind of have a job because of compliance, and I want to stop on that for a moment because we hear so often that compliance isn't security. The reality is compliance is security. It's just not the elimination of risk. Nothing is, as we know, unless you disconnect the system, throw it in a lake or something, right? But in the absence of compliance, anyone who's been doing this long enough knows if you show up to your engineering development peers, et cetera, and you ask them to do something without kind of a compliance requirement to tie it back to, you have a steep hill to climb. Where if you can point to a compliance requirement of here's why we have to do said thing, you have a much easier case to make. So I think compliance often, as I've said in some articles I've written, compliance is the floor, it's not the ceiling. But at
Mhm.
least without it, we'd be in free fall. It at least gives us a foundation to start upon. So I did want to call that point out you made earlier.
That's a very good point. And also, it helps because when you have a compliance framework, most of these things are ideally well thought out, have probably evolved over a period of years with a lot of inputs. And so, if you're trying to get an organization, let's say for a CISO coming to a job, and so we say, well, we need to do this, this, and this. Well, why? If I say, well, it's the Chris Hughes security model, like, yeah, right. But if I go, what this is something that comes from CISA or it comes from CMMC or fill in the blank with your own favorite acronym, and you can point to something externally, it's a little bit like, oh, okay. So in a way, we get a little bit of credibility for our approach,
Now,
regardless of your intelligence, your skills, your abilities, your knowledge, and all the capabilities you bring to it. As you had said, it's a hard sell when you can't point to an external requirement. And when time comes to go ahead and cut some budgets or trim back a little bit, and if you can't show a anchor out there to say we've got to do this or otherwise we can't keep this customer because we breach our agreement, we end up in a compliance problem, which means that we might not be able to process credit cards if it's PCI DSS, or at least charge a whole lot more. Or it could be a government thing where they might just simply say either like CMMC, we're going to take away your contract, or we're going to just write a big fine. So how many zeros have you got in your bank account? Let's go
yeah,
ahead and do that. And I was just looking recently at some of the fines that had come out. My last episode I did on the Irish security stuff, and 9-figure fines and even 10-figure fines, billion euros with exchange rates a little bit more. Uh, and you go, well, that's viewed by some organizations as a cost of doing business. And so here's a difficulty for us as CISOs. We may be able to say, in an ideal world, everything is pure and kind and just, and it's all secure. And at some level of leadership, I say the worst risk we have if we violate this is a $10,000 fine, but we can make $100,000 if we do it. So let's just do it. And then you'll find out that it's the equivalent. I remember is when I used to work in Charleston. I was out there with the Navy. I talked to a guy who used to work downtown. He said that parking garages were something like $20 a day, but a parking ticket was $10 a day. So you'd park on the street, you get 5 tickets, you'd pay them every week, and it was the cheaper way to park. And they didn't take away your license or your car because you kept paying them, but it was cheaper than parking in there. So from that perspective, it was a business decision. It wasn't.
It's
It's an interesting approach.
Yeah, no, I wanted to jump in there because it's so funny. If anyone who's been doing this for a long time, we've went through CISSP or other things like that. Again, you don't put a control on something that's worth more than the asset you're trying to protect. The business is making that business decision to say, we're not going to implement a control or meet a security requirement because it's cheaper to just pay the fine or the regulatory ramifications or whatever the kind of outcome of this is. And it's funny you said Charleston. I actually used to work in the Navy for several years as a civilian in the government and with Nywick Atlantic in Charleston as well. So we have that in common. Yeah, but you point out that great point. And then, this is a quite a double-edged sword in terms of compliance. On one hand, again, we need it, right? Because in its absence, we wouldn't do security. But it is a problem too. As you said, we got HIPAA, HITRUST, SOC 2, FedRAMP, CMMC, NIST 800-171, NIST 2, the EU, and I can go on and on. Like it just keeps going. And like, so we have these.
MOUSE. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we have these compliance framework sprawls that are happening, and it makes it really problematic and challenging for the business to navigate. Like, what have I met already? What do I still need to meet? Do I need to do all of these? Like, so there are efforts like the government last year had an RFI for regulatory harmonization. But we've had an administrative change. The speed of government is a natural force that's going to be at play. But I do hope we do see some regulatory harmonization because it can go the other direction where you said the cost of doing business can be so prohibitive due to fines and things like that, that can have an economic impact. If you look at like the EU, for example, they've set out to be a regulatory superpower, and that may be great in terms of compliance and security and governance, but it may have economic implications and even national security implications. So we got to pick our poison in terms of how heavy-handed we want to get with the compliance as a forcing function.
Yeah, and again, I mentioned this in last week's episode, and it was something I want to do the homework. I haven't had a chance to do it yet, but I had heard from somebody a couple of weeks ago. And again, I don't like dealing in rumors, so that's why I'm going to coach this with say trust but verify. Go look it up. That fines that are collected for GDPR violations by countries can be used as an offset for your dues that you have to pay into to be a member of the EU. It's sort of a pass through. So it's as if to say, hey, I've got my country club dues and they're $1,000 a month. But if I can go ahead and fine every golfer who puts a golf ball in my backyard $250, I might be able to be a member for free. As compared to making a profit on it, I don't know what happens past that point. But it does suggest, though, that their goals for doing these enforcement are twofold. One, on the business side, you say, I want to avoid unnecessary costs. But as you had said correctly, maybe the cost of doing business this way is less than the opportunity cost of not doing it at all. And then on the other side, from a regulatory perspective, ultimately say, what's the purpose of a government? To protect their citizens. And then secondly, territorial integrity. Then we go on and things like that. But just, basically you want to protect the life and safety of your citizenry. And to a certain extent, when we look at the concepts behind a lot of the regulations that come out, if they have that at the core, you go, okay, I get it. They might be a little bit more extreme. GDPR, when it says, hey, your IP address is PII. It's like, wait a minute, your IP address is ephemeral and it's generated on the fly unless it's 192.168.100.1. Well, that it travels with me for some reason everywhere. Every house that I set up seems to have that. But that's another story. So you had mentioned, though, and I made a note of this here, about AI. I want to make sure we don't skip AI before we get to the end of the show. So what are your thoughts about how's that going to impact everything we've been talking about so far?
Yeah, I'm not, I don't want to be the one to kind of get in here with a buzzword, right? But it is a real thing that's taking, getting traction and having an impact. For example, I don't, exact figures change depending on who's reporting them, but many organizations, I think it's like 70% of developers report they're using, coding assistants and Gen AI tools, LLMs, right, to accelerate quote unquote productivity. We now have a trend, if you've heard of this, called vibe coding. If you've heard of this, where they just,
You just
you kind of,
describe what you want and it writes it for you. Yeah.
and you don't even look, you don't even verify, validate it. You just run with it, right? And like again, to speed to market and competitive factors that are at play there. So you just kind of run with it. And so that's a factor. And then like so this quote unquote productivity boom of allowing people to develop more code faster, or even the democratization of development, where now people who aren't even developers, right, can just in plain natural language, produce applications and software through these tools without any kind of validation or verification, is going to have a massive impact, in my opinion, of exploding the attack surface. of, things that are out there. If you think about these large frontier models in terms of coding, a lot of them are trained on open source. And we talked about open source earlier in the conversation, which has many vulnerabilities, often is not well maintained, provenance and pedigree challenges, so all those challenges now get proliferated via the LLMs and coding assistants that people are using. And a lot of times, there's other studies showing that developers don't often go back and check the work of the LLM. They just kind of inherently trust it, right? And they just run with it. They don't, kind of double check it. So, that's going to be a problem. But at the same time, it's, there's this two-pronged challenge with AI where we have AI, the need to secure AI, but we also have AI for security. So we may be able to use, AI for security purposes. Like we know AppSec engineers and things like that are often outnumbered in large organizations, 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1 by developers. So if we can use these evolving, emerging technologies like LLMs and copilots and AI and agentic AI, things like that, to actually implement, a security at scale in a way we couldn't historically due to workforce constraints. There's an opportunity there too to, review more code, make recommendations, kind of provide quicker feedback loops to development teams and engineering teams. So it's this dual pronged challenge that I think is unfolding, and it'll be interesting to see, kind of which one wins out, whether it's, needing to secure AI or using AI for security.
Yeah, so the risk I think with the vibe coding is the open source supply chain attack vector. Now, it could, as you had said, it'll ingest all this stuff that's out there, mostly open source, because that's what you get your hands on it. And the second thing then is that if I am a patient threat actor, I'll go ahead and I'll put deliberately vulnerable code, but it'll run just fine, except when you add this extra little component at the end, which then goes ahead and triggers whatever that vulnerability would be. And then I just sit back and I wait. And everybody vibe codes. Eventually, this thing works out, and then I go look for it. And so these are the novel type of supply chain attacks that I'm thinking of that I'm hoping, well, the bad guys are going to think about it. I don't think they watch my podcast, but if so, give us a shout on LinkedIn and let us know. Yep, Dark Side is listening too. But what we find then is that people in general, given an opportunity between a tremendous workload and I get a whole bunch of stuff done, and wow, it's a shortcut, most people are going to take the shortcut. And so the availability of models that can generate code, whether it's Python code or whatever it happens to be, that seems to run, that doesn't go through traditional code validation, as you said, an AppSec engineer being able to say, hey, wait a minute, how do you keep up with the infinite monkeys on infinite typewriters generating code when it's really just your people vibe coding or some vice president of sales who said, I think it'd be really cool if I could do something like this. And hey, it works, off it goes, and they want to plug it in. How do we create a gatekeeper function in our enterprises to ensure that with this rise of AI generated code that we can check for the provenance of it? I don't know if we can tag it somehow, or the reverse might be almost like a canary. In the absence of a tag, it says, this was not developed by one of our developers. So I want to go ahead and give everybody their own, and this is me thinking on the fly, being the security guy. I'm going to give everybody, you have your public-private key pair and things like that. You are going to sign your code. And there's going to be a signed code there that's going to be based upon a signature from a key pair that is signed by a CA. And now any block of code that doesn't have that, and oh, by the way, if you put that thing into a piece of AI generated code, you agree in writing that you may be terminated with prejudice for violating that. Now, I didn't say you can't do it, but you can't sign it. What do you think about something like that? Would that at least cause a little bit of pause, or at least allow the AppSec team to look at stuff to say, hey, this all the code was generated last week. 80% is signed, 10% is not. I'm going to presume that it came out from this vibe coding. So it's going to get special attention. Thoughts about doing an approach like that?
Yeah, I think that could work in particular organizations. Again, going back to the kind of the risk tolerance thing and getting people willing to sign on the dotted line, whether it's the executives or the developers in terms of the code that's being produced. I think implementing sound security practices like CI/CD pipelines and SAST, DAST, SCA, all the acronym soup of security tooling that we're all used to, of course, should be part of kind of any deployment process to production environments. And then, the open source piece is problematic because even, it's just such a massive ecosystem that tracking every single library and component and dependency down and trying to determine whether it's known or trusted or not is a big problem. Some organizations are standing up, OSPOs, OSPO, open source program offices, that can kind of help them implement, some governance and rigor around how we consume and use open source in our software development and our applications and things like that. But again, it's a big undertaking. You got to have the resources to do that. You got to be a large enterprise that can afford to kind of fund a team for that purpose. And then just keeping up with it. Anyone who's had to manage, like, say golden images, if you're familiar with that term, you're always getting new requests, you're always making updates, you're always patching. Now imagine doing that for thousands and thousands and thousands of open source, libraries that you need to
Mhm.
maintain and say, this one's trusted, this one's trusted. Oh, we have a request for 87 more. We need to go review those and approve those. So it can be problematic. So, having tools that can help look at the pedigree, the provenance, the vulnerabilities, when it was last maintained or updated. Is it going to be reachable in runtime? All the things that we've talked about can go a long way as well. But the idea that you won't have some kind of mechanism and some kind of control in place is just absurd. Like, that's not a viable strategy. But we do know, as you said, it's human nature. Like, we're always looking for the shortcut, whether it's financially or physical fitness, whatever it is,
Mhm.
software development. We love our shortcuts. And we're going to do the same when it comes to software development. Not to mention the competing incentives we talked about, like speed to market and revenue. So we got to have these mechanisms in place. And in my opinion, we should be looking to use the same technology to our own benefit, rather than being a laggard as security often is and late to the party and, bolted on, et cetera. Like we would have been in previous technological ways like cloud and SaaS and mobile, et cetera. We should be using this technology early and often, seeing how we can use it to our own benefit and improve our security of the organization. Because to your point, the attackers are early adopters of this. They're already using this for improving phishing, improving inserting malicious code, improving, all the things that they do. So we should be looking to do it the same on our defensive cyber side.
Yeah, I'm thinking I'm going to be at RSA next month, and I'm almost kind of for fun. I'd like to make my AI bingo card where I'll take 24 different categories from Gartner. My free spot is AI. And anytime you see a vendor who fits into one of these categories that has AI in their advertising, you get a checkout. And then all of a sudden you see someone, like, "Hey, bingo." And you're like, what is that person talking about? And it says, yeah, he just went over the top for this particular thing. A little bit fun, at least gets people going around instead of like get a stamp, collect all the stamps, and then go ahead and involve in a drawing. I think what we're going to see, and you had very, very good insight on that one, is that if AI is being used both by adversaries and by our people who are creating code that are not really our adversaries per se, but they do represent a kind of a competitive force and within the organization, both for budget, for time to market on things such as that, and then also for political viability. Because at the end of the day, someone might argue, "Hey, security, how many dollars have you put to the bottom line?" But we put the money to the bottom line. He said, "Yeah, but we make sure that it gets to the bottom line, that it doesn't go away." Putting AI into our defensive strategies, being able to look at the tool sets that we have right. We turn to vendors. And so for those of us who served in the military, understood the term COTS, right? Commercial off the shelf software. And so when we have a room full of developers, we go, well, why don't we just find a COTS application for it? It never is a perfect fit. So kind of last thought as we're running out of time here, but do I reduce my risk by crowdsourcing my software with the equivalent of a COTS, or am I managing my risk better by doing my own development in house? And that almost sounds like a toss up question I should put out on LinkedIn. But what are your thoughts on
I think you should definitely put it out on LinkedIn. But in my experience, I've done a lot of work with, large federal agencies, as we talked about throughout my career. And this build versus buy decision is constantly something that they're trying to navigate. And it really comes down to resources and expertise and core competencies. For example, do I have the financial resources and the security and development resources to go and build something myself, maintain it in perpetuity indefinitely, right? And make it more secure because you got to patch it, you got to maintain it, you got to securely configure it. You got to do that forever, basically, as long as your organization or others relying on you use it. Or am I better off going to use a commercial off the shelf software solution? And even that is a spectrum. There's a big difference between, say, a GitHub, right, who's run by Microsoft and used by millions of developers around the world, versus a mom and pop SaaS startup that just started and doesn't even have a security team member. So that the COTS solution is a big spectrum, just like building it yourself is a big. Maybe you have 2 developers, maybe you have 20 developers, and a security engineer embedded with them. It really depends on what your resources are and your core competencies. Like, do I want to be in the business of building and maintaining this thing? Or am I in the core competency of delivering value to my customers, my stakeholders, my mission owners, and instead buying something and letting, the commercial industry do what it does best. And that's something each organization has to navigate. And it might look different, even within the organization, depending on the particular tool or software or capability, that you're kind of discussing at the time. So it's always, it depends in my opinion. There's no perfect answer on that.
Well, that's a good insight and a good way to dodge it, but you're right, it does depend, as my lawyer buddy would tell me, and we are out of time. So, Chris Hughes, I want to thank you very much for being on our show. I appreciate the fact that you've been a fan, if you will, of CISO Tradecraft, and now you're a part of it. And I do appreciate also your contributions to the community with the books that you've written on effective vulnerability management, software transparency, and people can go and they can find those up on the net. And you are on LinkedIn as Resilient Cyber, and people could find you there. So thank you very much for being part of the podcast, Chris. And for those who are listening on CISO Tradecraft, we have a lot more than just podcasts. So make sure you're following us on LinkedIn. We also have our YouTube channel if you want to see my smiling face once a week. And until next time, this is your host, G. Mark Hardy. Thank you for being part of CISO Tradecraft, and stay safe out